Shareholder Primacy from Free Float Media, a podcast about activist investing, securities law, and all the ways the financial and legal worlds intersect and collide in real life. I'm usually here with Ann Lipton, who's a law professor at Tulane, but Ann is once again traveling to yet another conference. So we invited two of her colleagues, Adriana Robertson of the University of Chicago, an institution that's near and dear to my heart, and Slava of Boston College. And we'd like to talk about what, at least I think, and I hope they agree, is a fascinating subject, which is how issuers, how companies sort of run or control and, dare say, sometimes manipulate the annual meeting process. And both Slava and Adriana have done some really interesting research about how companies kind of structure their meetings, and that's what we're here to talk about. So, Adriana, say hi.
Hello.
And Slava, how are you?
Hello, Mike. How are you?
Okay, great. Well, so let's kind of dig into this. Each of you has done some related but distinct, as I said, pretty fascinating and very relevant research about AGMs, annual general meetings, or we'll just say annual meetings. First, I'd like each of you to sort of describe, quite briefly that research, and then we can, as we dig into this, talk about the relationship between them and the implications and some of the next steps and so forth. Adriana, let's start with you. Your paper was, which I loved, the title was called Hidden Agendas. So why don't we hear about that and some of its findings and how you went about that?
Sure. So delighted to be here. Long-time listener, first-time caller.
Wonderful. Thanks. I've never thought I'd be in a position where someone would actually say that to me.
There you go.
But, all right,
first
cool.
time.
All right, go ahead.
So this is joint work with Scott Hurst, who I guess is down the street from Slava
Yes.
at BU. And so what do we have in mind when we talk about hidden agendas? Well, what we found was that the overwhelming majority of the time, something like 88% of all meetings and like 90% of annual meetings, shareholders don't know what they're going to be voting on before the record date. So the agenda for the meeting, the resolutions that they'll have to vote on, they don't know what they are. Now, if you're worried about empty voting, then this would be a feature potentially, not a bug. But what Scott and I had in mind was large institutional investors, and in particular, the folks that do a lot of securities lending. Right?
Oh,
and
so if you're lending out stock mostly so other people can short,
exactly right.
You don't have control over those votes when the meeting agenda is published. All right, go ahead.
That's exactly right. Because after all, we call it lending, but that's a bit of a misnomer. You don't own it once you've lent it because whoever borrowed it owns it, and they're going to turn around and sell it to a short seller.
Or at least own the voting rights.
That's right. You have the economic right.
Exactly right.
Exactly, and that's what we have in mind, because the folks that are doing the lending are still economically tied to the company. So you would kind of want them to vote, but they don't know. Right, what they're going to be voting on at that time.
And so this pertains, just to make sure you understand, pertains to U.S. companies. This is all U.S. SEC regulated, largely domiciled in Delaware type of places.
It doesn't have to be Delaware, but
it doesn't have to, but there's a lot of them. Okay, so and the numbers you said was some enormous proportion do not disclose that agenda in advance of, as you said, the record date.
That's right.
All right, go ahead.
So that's the sense in which they're hidden. We don't mean them to be hidden. We don't think anybody's doing this, intentionally per se. We actually think this. When we were digging into this, we concluded it was probably more just, we've always kind of followed these timelines, and these are our checklists, and we don't really bother. At least we're not trying to cast aspersions. Maybe you have better information than I do.
I don't know. I'm a little more skeptical, but we can talk about that.
Yeah, I'd love to hear your perspective.
Sure.
We didn't want to go quite that far because,
you need evidence to be able to go that far, and it's hard to figure out what's going on in people's heads.
Well, and laziness and path dependence and just doing it the same way we've always done it is, at least to my mind, if that's a sufficient explanation, then I'm willing to be satisfied with that.
All right.
And then, Adriana, just following up on that, how often these agendas are actually determined before they're reviewed in proxy materials? how often we can know that management actually knew what is going to be voted on. For example, if there is a shareholder proposal attempt going on.
Yeah, they're going to know. The rules are such that they will for sure know about all of those shareholder proposals well in advance of the record date. For no other reason than, like, a lot of these things had to be sent to the printer, right, several days before they need to post them. So we think our view is that it wouldn't take much for companies to make this available, but it would require a change relative to what companies currently
change
do.
in practice, though.
That's
probably
right.
not a change in. There's nothing. Well, I mean, there's nothing in probably SEC level rules that somehow make this the case. This is entirely. It sounds like this is entirely up to the control of the company about when they disclose the agenda for a meeting.
So there are rules about how far in advance of the meeting they have to disclose it.
Right.
And everybody, to our knowledge, is following those rules, or at least we're certainly not claiming that anybody's falling afoul of them. But it's just that the current rules permit this. Now, could a rule change this? Of course. Of course, you could.
Okay. So we
by
could
rule.
we could impose requirements on when people do this. We'll talk about that in a little while.
Yeah.
But right now, the disclosure, and when we say the agenda, we kind of mean the nominees for a board election. What else? Probably the any kind of precatory shareholder proposal, a whole range of proposals.
Yep.
And then other kind of more routine stuff like the auditor election or auditor ratification.
Yeah, those are pretty.
Any kind of equity plan approvals or bylaw amendments. So there's a whole range of things. An agenda could be anywhere between 2 and 20 items.
That's exactly right. And some of them are super easy to predict, like, depending on our say on pay cycle, we already know that there's going to be a say on pay vote.
Right, or reapproving the frequency of the say on pay vote.
Right, exactly.
Or something like that. And then others are much less predictable. As Slava started saying, you don't know what shareholder proposals you're going to get. But it sounds like companies know enough about these to be able to put them in the agenda. Right.
Well, that's certainly our view.
What is there any kind of, are they doing this, after the record date, just a day or two? Is there any kind of dimensions to the timing that they're doing this?
They're typically relatively close in time. I mean, it would genuinely be, when we looked at it for most companies and most meetings, it was going to be an order of like a week or two earlier. That you would have to let people know. And even that was going to be just to give people, 5 days. That was what Scott and I had in mind. We wanted to try to make a proposal that would be as unobtrusive as possible, given what companies are already doing. Because, they are trying to run a business. So they shouldn't be spending all of their time and energy doing this.
Right. So, and what was the data that you would, I'm just curious, what was the evidence for that you got to the 90%, those numbers? Where's all that from?
So we used companies' SEC filings. So we downloaded all of the proxy statements, and the preliminary and the definitive proxy statements. We have the dates of the meetings and the record dates from ISS data, and then we just compare it. We just look whether
that was really easy. The data part of this was very straightforward.
Yeah, it was really nice.
All right, cool. All right, let's talk for a little bit then. Slava, you did some analogous research on record dates themselves. And I found this just startling when you first explained it to me a year or whatever ago. So why don't you help us through that for a little bit?
Thanks, Mike. And it's really useful that I will follow Adriana because we are using similar data. We just use all proxy statements during many, many years. And this is what I'm going to describe. It comes from joint work with Cliff Holderness, who is my colleague at Boston College. And the paper was about the distribution of voting rights to shareholders. Let me emphasize a few specific findings and then talk about bigger implications that are related to what Adriana was saying. So we find that in more than 90% of shareholder meetings, shareholders who use proxy statements to learn about the record date would receive that information after the record date has passed. So basically, if you want to do anything with shares that you own, in terms of you want to increase your position or sell some shares, before the record date.
Or not lend.
Exactly. It's almost impossible. Now, record dates, they're in some sense much simpler than agendas. This is just one date that you would need to disclose. You don't need to prepare. You don't need to do anything. You just need to include it in preliminary proxy material if it is distributed. So we find that it's almost always not disclosed on time. We, however, find that very often, especially when there are shareholder proposals or contested elections, this information is material in the following sense. When shares go ex-vote, there is a significant change in stock price. And also there is a significant increase in trading activity. So some market participants who know when the record date is are trading on that material information. However,
so let me make sure I get this. That the general practice would be for a company to disclose the record date after the proxy material comes out.
Well, it's in the same proxy material.
I understand proxy material, but in other words, you have no basis. You know, the record date's already passed, so it's already been. But there are people who somehow are trading on that around that record date, so somehow they know what's going on.
Yes, there are institutions that specialize in exactly that they collect that information, they engage with companies, they engage with proxy solicitors, and they then share that information for financial reward. Also, there are differences between exchanges. Companies that are listed on NASDAQ are not required to inform NASDAQ about record dates, for example. NYSE is different. NYSE requires all listed companies to provide information on record dates at least 10 days before record date happens.
Oh, so 10 days. If you're NYSE, if you're listed on the New York Stock Exchange, 10 days before the actual record date, the date of that record date, you have to have let the New York Stock Exchange know what that record. So New York Stock Exchange at least knows that information.
They have a website. It's called Proxy Rulings, but I don't think investors know about this.
And that website became public after our paper became public. So when we were writing the paper.
So you identified this problem where the New York Stock Exchange basically had that information kind of privately.
We actually purchased data from NYSE.
Oh.
And what we purchased from NYSE included exact timing on when this information was communicated to subscribers of services for New York Stock Exchange. So when we were writing our paper, that information was sold to subscribers to NYSE services. NYSE was selling a lot of data, not only on record dates for voting, also on record dates for dividends, on record date for other events. We purchased that data.
Just like any other subscriber. So you were acting just like a subscriber.
Yes. So at that point, it wasn't publicly available at all. And even now, I'm not sure when it becomes available publicly, but this is a separate question. But the point is, let me get back to
go ahead. Sorry.
Bigger picture question. In the study, to understand how interesting it is, what Adriana is describing, what we're doing, is that if you compare the distribution of voting rights, which includes the date and the agenda, it is very different from distribution of cash dividends. Companies announce in advance what is going to be the dividend, or agenda in our context. Companies say in advance publicly when is record date for dividends, and it's always ahead of time. So if you think about dividends, it's all transparent, it's all clear, it's all announced ahead of time. When you move to shareholder voting, it's all messed up.
Yeah, that's what it sounds like.
We don't know what will be on the agenda. We don't know when we need to be shareholders of record to participate in decisions. It's all very opaque. Why? Because rules are very opaque for the voting. There are actually no requirements that are very harsh and clear, neither from states, federal regulators, SEC, or exchanges. And we believe this is why companies have a lot of flexibility in terms of deciding when to disclose and what to disclose.
Wow.
Again, it's a very sharp contrast to another distribution, which is cash dividend distribution.
Right. So just like when the agenda is hidden or the record date is hidden, this is something that companies have a huge amount of control over. Adriana, you seem to say that it's mostly routine about how they manage that control, but I'm familiar with some cases that have been involved in some where it may have not been so routine.
Well, that's fascinating.
We can talk about that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Anyway, so now that we have kind of the contours of the findings and the research and so forth, and Slava buying data from the NYSE and you getting data from wherever, we should probably explore some of the implications. I think you have some very solid or very specific recommendations about what to do about all this, what's the problem and why, and what to respond. But let's take a quick break, and then we can cover all that in a little bit here at Shareholder Primacy.
Shareholder Primacy is brought to you by FreeFlowAnalytics.com, the only free database of corporate directors, their influence, and their performance. If you own a stock or retirement plan, go to FreeFlowAnalytics.com and look up which of your elected directors are performing well and which aren't. Use your vote in the alternative democracy and get your data at FreeFlowAnalytics.com. Now, back to the show.
Welcome back to Shareholder Primacy. I'm Mike Levin, here with Adriana Robertson of the University of Chicago and Slava Foss of Boston College. We'd like to talk about some of the implications from this research. Adriana, did you have any? You had a thought here, I think.
I think it's so funny that because I know that NYSE still sells a bunch of data to a lot of people, but I didn't know that they made these proxy rulings public to everyone after your paper came out. That's really funny.
That's pretty impactful, I think. So,
yeah.
Your sense, Slava, was it was the paper that kind of motivated this?
I will not take the full credit of that, but I do want to again say that we purchased data from NYSE. It wasn't free in public. Now it's free in public. So if we did it, then I'm proud that this is our contribution.
Well,
for sure.
So I've been on boards where we've had to set record dates and where we've had to disclose agendas. And I'll say that, normally it was, as you say, we would do this all kind of after the fact. And I never really thought of it until I started looking into the papers that you wrote, that this was something, this could be a big problem. And we also saw this in a recent case that I was familiar with. I've done a little bit of writing on and talked about it in a previous podcast related to a company called Massimo. I don't know if either of you have followed Massimo, MASI is a ticker, and an activist by the name of Quentin Coffey at Politan had run a serial proxy contest 2 years in a row. The most recent one, and it was a whole deal related to empty voting, but he knew the a friendly to the CEO shareholder learned of the record date well before everybody else because the CEO had disclosed it. There's some evidence now that the CEO had done something like this, and that friendly shareholder was able to build up a position, but it shorted at the same time. So that's where the empty voting came in. So this happens. There's manipulation of this in ways that, or there's potential manipulation that is potentially really bad. And so I was kind of curious. How did you in your research start to figure out? Is there any kind of measurement or assessment of the adverse effect on just ordinary shareholders of what you were finding out? Slava or Adriana, about how this works? Go ahead.
Well, it's so. I don't know. Maybe Slava is much more clever than we were, but it was really hard for us to try to figure out what the counterfactual is, because we were interested in the voting side and how people would actually vote, what votes might actually have come out differently in a world where investors had known and could recall their shares again.
Sure.
What we have in mind is the lending side.
Right.
And the empty voting side is sort of like the fascinating evil twin of the lending problem.
Right, exactly.
Right?
But again, empty voting is possible only if you know the record date in advance.
Absolutely.
Which is the one of the big reasons that companies up till now, I think, it's unlikely, but have been concerned. They didn't want people either empty voting or probably not wanting them just acquire shares.
Right, just buying into the record date.
Just buying into the record date. So
that's exactly right.
Slava,
But
go ahead, Adriana.
No, just the you can't sort of. Well, you can do other things to try to limit empty voting, I suppose. Buying into the record date, I don't know why people get too upset. Maybe there are really good reasons to be upset about that. But if you have an economic interest, you have an economic interest.
Exactly. And the U.S. securities law allow you to buy a day before a record date, vote, and then sell. I mean, that's just how it works. So, and even there's no real law against empty voting in the U.S. or it's not illegal per se.
Well, and if somebody was really upset, like I guess one thing that Scott and I talked a lot about when we were working on this project was if the reason we have these hidden agendas is because we're so worried about empty voting that we want to kind of make it difficult to do, there are much more direct ways, assuming that we actually really had a problem with it, we wanted to do something about it. Yes. We could just try to deal with that directly rather than making it so that investors that do have these real long-term economic interests can't exercise their rights.
Right. All right. So in Slava, you kind of saw, one of the questions I know that you always think about when you're doing research is, what can we do about this problem that we've started to identify? And I think you started saying one of the responses was to publish, at least for the NYSE, to publish their record dates, publish the record date and not necessarily like sell the information. Is that kind of right? Do I understand it properly?
Yes, and then for NASDAQ there is no such thing, by the way, still. But I think going back to the question, Mike, maybe one result in our paper would help assess the economic magnitude of what we're talking about. When shares go ex vote and there is a shareholder proposal on the agenda, we find that stock prices decline by about 65 basis points. And this is highly statistically significant change. Now, the question is whether we care about it. Now, imagine you're a shareholder who wants to sell the stock. If you sell the stock before X vote date, you will receive the value of the vote as part of the price. If you sell shares right after X vote date, the price will be 65 basis points lower. The question is, do we want investors to be aware of that? That this is the date when prices are going to drop. Now, this is not a question for cash dividends because whenever you sell, you're protected against price changes that happen due to cash dividend distribution. This is not the case for the voting right, because if you sell when stocks go ex vote, you didn't vote. Your vote was wasted, basically, right? Because maybe you're not interested in voting. You're not that type of investor. So we believe, I think, if you want to think about how that information should be disseminated, the best way to think about it is material information. We want all investors to have equal access to that information. We do not want some people to know when vote record date takes place and some people don't. This would be definitely, and again, I'm not a legal scholar here and not a lawyer, but if you took any other material information and distributed just to some people in financial markets, that would be very challenging for the company. Here, yet we see a situation in which company disseminates information that is material only to some market participants, and some people don't know about it. So in that sense, we believe it definitely calls for regulation, calls for, again, maybe simplification of the process. You could just say that everyone needs to disclose record date 10 days ahead of the record date. And that's it. So simple.
So one of the
Adriana,
things,
go ahead. Yeah.
Just one of the things that just to this point of it just seems so odd that the rules are the way they are, that you can do things this way. I mean, in some ways, it seems truly strange that when we set up our proxy voting system, we set it up in such a way that this is completely allowed. Because again, just to reiterate, like everything that we're describing is permitted under the rules. Nobody
has been done for this way for decades.
And indeed, I think it's exactly the fact that it's been done this way. So I was talking to kind of the SEC lawyer at a public company who's a friend of mine about this, and I said, "Do you guys do this? Why do you put out your agenda after the record date?" And he was like, "I mean, probably."
Doesn't everybody?
And I said, "But doesn't this seem like a big problem?" And he just kind of looked at me and was like, "But before the record date, we don't know who to send it to. So who are we supposed to notify? The whole point of the record date is that's when we do the broker search, and that's when we find out. We find out who the shareholders are as of that date." And so I then sat there and sort of like, it was like a light came on in my head. This is all based on like the 1970s, when you first had to figure out who the shareholders were so that then you could mail this stuff to them. But of course, we don't live in that world anymore. You could still just post it on Edgar, and then everybody would know.
Well, and it's actually, you're absolutely right. It's not like a shareholder is relying on a company's own like website, which could be pretty erratic. I mean, there is an official centralized repository of all these kind of official notices that the SEC runs and owns and maintains. There is absolutely no reason why we can't center this disclosure around that too.
But in a
required
world
to be posted there. Go ahead, yeah.
Right. No, but in a world where, you had to figure out who the shareholders were as of the record date and then send the material to them, the idea that you would have to tell them what the record date was, then the answer would be, but I don't know who those people. So now you would need a record date for the record date, and it would be this infinite recursion.
This kind of recursion.
Adriana, just to support what you are saying, again, remember cash dividends. 100 years ago, we had to send checks. Right? Yes, we're not doing it that way these days, but record dates for dividends are disclosed ahead of record dates. It is required by exchanges that companies publicly disclose record dates ahead of time. So
again, I'm not disagreeing that we could change. Again, my claim is not that this is a problem for changing it. My claim is only that this is an account of, I think, how we came to be in this bizarre position that we're in.
Right. All right. So it sounds like both of you would, after you've kind of looked at this and probably thought about it now, because both of you did this research at least a few years ago. So you've had a chance to kind of talk to people and talk to me about it and so forth. You're still you remain convinced that this is an area that the SEC. I mean, I don't know what the SEC is going to do in the next 4 years, and it's probably not likely they're going to focus on this. But if they were to, what would this look like? Just a pretty straightforward reform that says what?
I mean, we have a little proposal Scott and I have in our paper that just basically like it would be adding. I think it's adding like literally 9 words to one rule that just says like, and post this thing on Edgar 5 days or like it's really so simple. But you're right. This is kind of one of those good government proxy plumbing type things that nobody gets too fussed about because it's part of the duct tape and spit.
Other than me, who gets
and the
really
two of us,
aggravated
we spent ages.
Companies manipulate this stuff.
I got very similar feedback from some people at the SEC that said the voting plumbing thing is always not item number 1 on the agenda.
No. Well,
it's always something more important, and they never get to actually.
Well, yeah, I mean, but part of the problem that my friends who do what I do have observed is that there's a lot of parties to this that have a lot of interest in the proxy plumbing system, as we call it, remaining as obscure and baroque and as complicated as it is. There's a lot of people who make a lot of money off of the system as it currently stands. And quite conveniently, that helps issuers, companies, kind of, routine. Again, as you say, most companies, it's not going to matter when they do this. But there's going to be a few cases, in contested elections where, really tough situations where investors could have really benefited from knowing this, and companies knew it and wanted to manage it this way. I like to tell a lot of people that companies hold a lot of cards in these situations. They have a lot that they can do to kind of influence outcomes that are within the law, that's kind of within current practice, that still makes life kind of hard for their shareholders. And this sounds like it's a perfect example.
Can I ask you a question? Is that
Sure.
allowed?
Of course, let me hear the question, then I'll decide.
I guess I can ask it. The question is whether you'll answer.
That's fine.
From your perspective, because this is something that I certainly thought about as we were writing this paper, we were convinced that the data supported what we were saying. But the question that always bops around in my head is, well, do investors, does this sort of thing actually impact their ability to do what they care about?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay.
Oh, yeah.
Do you have any examples that you could?
Yeah, sure. I don't traffic in the world of proposals much, but the ability to tell other shareholders, I'll have other shareholders, I'm working on a project, and they'll say, "Oh, I think I'm going to acquire some stock because or something like that." And again, it doesn't sound great, but it's allowed, and people do that. But I'll tell them after things become public. They say, "Oh, wow, I've been following this company for a while. I own a de minimis position, and I really wanted to own more, but I can't now because the record date because I just missed the record date or something." Okay, and all these disclosures, part of the problem is that an activist is working behind the scenes for months and months and months before, and a company knows everything the activist is kind of up to, and can kind of get ahead of you in some really important ways in terms of communicating with other shareholders and in terms of trying to set up the board to do certain things. And this is just one example of where occasionally, not always, not routinely, again, I said before, it's not very common that someone's going to be manipulating this system. Okay, most shareholder meetings are pretty routine. But when it does happen, it's really a big deal.
Yeah.
And really can hurt the ability of an activist to try to influence change, or we'd like to think help other shareholders or whatever we're doing. So it most of the time it doesn't matter, but when it does matter, it really, really does matter a lot.
And from a theoretical, corporate governance theory perspective, we always say that, well, it's the threat of successful activism that matters. So even if there's very few instances where, an activist actually does something, the fact that they can do it successfully puts everyone else on their best behavior.
Exactly. So just the idea that there's this community of activists out there that are kind of looking over companies, hopefully, our guess is that it helps keep at least some companies improving. But who knows? So, all right. Any final thoughts, Slava, Adriana, from what we've been talking about? Or are you guys in good shape?
This
Slava,
is great
you have
fun.
any questions for me? No? Okay, good.
It was a really great conversation.
All right, good. I'm glad. Let's wrap this up then. Thank you, Adriana and Slava. It's terrific talking to you. This is Shareholder Primacy, hosted by Ann Lipton and me, Mike Levin, but not this week. It's just Mike Levin. I'm an independent activist investor and advisor to investors about their activist situations. Adriana is a professor at the University of Chicago Law School. Slava is a finance professor at the Carroll School of Management at Boston College. You can find Adriana at law.uchicago.edu. And you can find Slava at bc.edu. And you can find me, Mike, at theactivistinvestor.com. Our podcast is produced and distributed by Free Flow Media. Thanks for listening, and we will talk